When do you need to use the force overwrite option in the synchronizer? This option is only enabled for the session, so if you enable it and restart it, it actually will be disabled. First, we have to look at when the synchronizer updates data between ACT and Outlook, and this data is only brought over from ACT to Outlook or vice versa when the date of the modification of the data is different than our index and the data is actually different. Even if the data is different and the data is the same, the data will not be transferred. But if the modifications are actual, this data will come over. So when do you need to use a force overwrite? Well, you need to use it every time a setting that affects data representation in Outlook is changed, i.e. if you change the field mapping, or you change the contact activities body text, if you change the subject line modifications, if you change the file as setting, if you change the filter modifications, or any other option that affects the data representation in Outlook, you need to go back in the synchronizer and use the force overwrite. This will overwrite the data so the new representation takes over. Let's look at the synchronizer and see what we're talking about. If you change any of the settings on the contact body text, you will need to do a force override, because that doesn't change any of the indexes or any of the data history. If you change a filter, or any of the filters, you need to do a force override. If you change the file as to be different, you need a force override. If you change any of the activities, anything that does with the tag calls, that does activity modification, calendar or task, any of the changes here in the subject line modifications, you need to do a force override. If you change any of the settings on the body text of the activities, you need to do a force override. If you do a change on the field mapping, so if you map another field on the field mapping, force override. If you need to do a context, if you do modifications on how categories are represented in Outlook, you need to do a force override, as well as any of the modifications to calendar and tasks and the body text headers. The same way, if you do any modifications here, you need to do a force override. The same if you do modifications to the contact fields list, you do a force override. As well as if you do a history type filter. So if you change your history types and you change the filtering, you need to do the force override. And the force override is very simple to do. You go to the conversion options. By default, this option is not set. Just click on force override, click on process and process users, and that will force all the data from ACT over to Outlook and force overwrite the data into Outlook. You can determine the direction of the force overwrite through the synchronizer tab in 123 synchronizer. You go to synchronize, and on the main sync options there's the dominant database. The dominant database is the database that will overwrite the other database. In this case, there's ACT database is dominant during synchronization. That means ACT will overwrite the Outlook database. Now, if you want to do a reverse force override from Outlook to ACT, all you do is you change the dominant database to Outlook database is dominant during synchronization, and the Outlook data then overwrite the ACT data. That's very useful if you have made lots of modifications in Outlook and you just don't want to merge the databases, and you just want the Outlook database to merge with the ACT database. You make it dominant and then enable force overwrite, and then all that data will come from Outlook into ACT.